Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for spending a hot Saturday evening with us here at Reid Hall in this wonderful Grande Salle. My name is Pauline Lemasson. I am the development chairperson of AAWE and one of the organizers of tonight's event, along with Brunhilde, Biebuyck, and Robin Silver, Marie-Madeleine Charrier. So I also have the privilege of introducing Robin Silver, current president of the Smith College Club of France. Robin has studied and worked in France since 1976. She graduated from Smith in 1976 after spending her junior year abroad in Paris, where she studied both at Sciences Po and with renowned medieval historian Georges Duby. She did her graduate work at Sciences Po in economics and finance before embarking on a career working for French multinationals and cultural institutions, most notably as head of mergers and acquisitions for Louis Vuitton, and then LVMH, director of licensing for Givenchy Couture, and managing director of the commercial subsidiary of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, Paris. Please join me in welcoming Robin Silver, who will do introductions.
Hi, everybody. I'm usually the one introducing other people, so no one has ever introduced me like that before. Thank you. So welcome to this exceptional event celebrating Ann Mah's fictionalized but heavily research-based story of Jacqueline Bouvier's JYA experience in Paris immediately following the Second World War. That will be a springboard for a shared reflection on the transformative power of studying abroad, be it on junior year abroad or otherwise. The event is co-hosted by Columbia Global Centers, Reid Hall, Smith College, Northampton, and the Smith College Club of France, with the driving force of AAWE's development chairperson, Pauline Lemasson, who just introduced me, and support from the American Library in Paris, I hope I don't forget anybody, Inspirel, the American Embassy in Paris, and the Red Wheelbarrow, which is a wonderful English language bookstore, and they will be selling Ann Mah's book at our reception, which is next door in an air-conditioned space, after the event. Now you know. Unfortunately, Ann cannot be here with us in Paris tonight. She is in Washington, D.C. with her family, recovering from a serious health incident. But Ann and her husband, Chris, who is a U.S. diplomat, have recorded a short message for us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Mah, and I wrote Jacqueline in Paris. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this great event. I wish I was there with you today. I want to thank the Columbia Centers for hosting, Smith College in Paris, the U.S. Embassy in Paris, the AAWE, Inspirel, and the American Library in Paris. This book is about how Jackie became Jackie. It is so fitting that today's event is at Reid Hall. Jackie could not have become Jackie without the Smith in Paris program. As I researched the book, it became clear that Jackie's year here introduced me to themes that would color the rest of her life. Her sense of history, politics, the arts, literature. I also learned and tried to show in the book that Paris 1949 to 1950 taught Jackie to be self-reliant in a difficult time. It was a privilege for me to research the book. And I owe thanks to everyone and to so many people, including Pauline, Brune, and Marie-Madeleine. I hope my health will allow me to be there soon and see you all in person. Cheers and have a great evening.
I said it's wonderful to hear from Ann in person because she's a long road to recovery. So before handing the floor to Brunhilde Biebuyck, who is going to share the history of Reid Hall with us, I would like to share a few thoughts with you. Smith College's JYA program is the oldest existing U.S. Year Abroad program in France. We will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2025. Over the years, several thousand Smith students have spent a year abroad studying here. Some stayed or came back, others did not. Some came back to marry or to work, but most built friendships that have withstood the test of time. And not a single Smithie returned to the US without having been transformed in some way. In the century that separates the first JYA students from our current cohort, the world and France have changed a lot. Today's JYA students are solidly entrenched in the digital era, come from diverse backgrounds, and a wide array of majors, including STEM, theater, political science, and film. We didn't have STEM students in my time. They were only humanities students. And before that, until the 70s, I think, you had to be a French major. Their expectations may be very different from those of the women who arrived just after World War II. And yet, so many aspects of studying abroad are clearly shared, regardless of the era. Ann's book captures that well. For those of us who have the privilege of going to university in the US, our undergraduate years provide a safe space to transition from adolescence to adulthood. It is a time for exploration and self-discovery, for moving beyond one's intellectual and cultural comfort zones, and for imagining one's future and more. The study abroad experience is a heightened version of college. It makes us question things we take for granted. It plunges us into a context where we may not understand the social codes. I think we've all been there and may have some funny stories to tell, where who we are at home means nothing to people we meet and frequent. Jacqueline was debutante of the year in New York, and followed by Harper's Bazaar. In France, who cared? They don't know what that is. It provides the junior abroad an anonymous space of unchecked freedom to redefine ourselves, present ourselves as we want to be, and experiment as well. It also tests our resilience, as Ann mentioned, and self-reliance. It requires us to be open-minded, non-judgmental, to push our boundaries. It makes us the outsiders, the foreigners, and obliges us to take a radically different posture. Language, of course, is a key aspect of the journey. As all of us here today know, language is culture. It is not just words, but a language reflects a thought process and values. So we are indeed not the same person in each language we speak, although some of us have managed, with more or less success, to find ways to reconcile the various languages we speak and still let our personalities shine through. But you'll hear more about this from our panelists and perhaps some of our guests as well. We have one person who was here during Jackie's year abroad, Ann Athling, and Lois Grzyebin, our President Emerita, who was here the following year, so they may have some memories to share with us. And now, let us welcome Brunhilde Biebuyck, who will tell us about the history of Reid Hall.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see all of you. There's so many more women here than men. I wonder why. Okay, let's get this thing on the road. So, a comprehensive history of Reid Hall had never been made until I decided to dig into our meager archives, followed by forays at the Library of Congress and archives at Barnard, Columbia, and Smith College. Columbia's Western European Humanities librarian Meredith Levin partnered with me for over 5 years, and the pandemic really helped, in order, in order to piece together information from correspondence, newspaper articles, photographs, reports, and the like. We discovered that documents relating to this property are scattered in many parts of the United States and Europe, and new materials surface regularly. Legend had it that 4 Rue de Chevreuse was built as the hunting lodge for the Duc de Chevreuse, only to become a convent at a later date. In our research, we discovered that the reality of this property is much more interesting than its legends. As this presentation will show, the site was successively reinvented to meet the needs of the time. Our first reference dates to 1750, when the property was a private residence surrounded by fields and orchards. It then harbored a small porcelain factory qualified as a miserable establishment of no real interest. The Dagoty brothers secured this factory around 1800 and transformed it into a world-renowned manufacture subsidized by the Empress Joséphine and later by the Duchesse d'Angoulême. Dagoty was especially known for its beautiful gilded tableware, and it enjoyed significant notoriety throughout Europe and the United States. In 1817, for example, James Monroe bought a 30-piece dinner service, which is still at the White House, and Andrew Jackson bought an even grander set after the factory shut down. As Dagoty ceased its operations, orthopedic surgery and post-surgery therapy had become very popular in France. When 4 Rue de Chevreuse came up for sale, a professor at the Faculté de Médecine de Paris bought the place and founded a residential treatment center for scoliosis, malformation of the feet, and muscle contractures. He incorporated an outdoor gym for his patients and designed a spinal traction device to treat scoliosis. Over time, however, his theories, methods, and apparatus came under severe criticism. Accused of malpractice, he was forced to shut down his facility in 1834. Today, however, his name has been re-established as one of the pioneers in orthopedic therapy. Next. In the 1820s and 30s, a Protestant spiritual awakening movement had developed throughout France and Europe. In Paris, it was led by the pastor Jean Monod, whose son, together with the pastor Jean-Jacques Keller, decided to buy 4 Rue de Chevreuse, viewing the property as an ideal location for a boarding school. It opened in 1834, with Monod as director, Keller as teacher, and Monod's sister as manager of the lodgings. Next. Essentially evangelical in its objectives, the Keller Institute was known for its rigorous intellectual, moral, and spiritual Calvinist teaching methods. It boarded approximately 60 students who were enrolled for 2 to 5 years. Half of the students were international and many were Americans. Numerous alumni became notable players on the world stage, like André Gide, who wrote about the Pension Keller in his novels Si le grain ne meurt and Les Faux Monnayeurs. When Keller died in 1889, his son continued operating the school for a few years, but enrollments progressively diminished, especially after the opening of the École Alsacienne on the Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs in 1874. He eventually began renting, then selling parts of the property. He leased a plot of land in the back garden to the Church of the Holy Trinity, now the American Cathedral on Avenue Georges V. Holy Trinity established a prefabricated church on this plot, baptized as St. Luke's in the Garden, or the Little Tin Church, St. Luke's Chapel dispensed the only English-speaking service on Paris's left bank. Right here at Reid Hall. Isn't it absolutely amazing? It came to play an important role in the social and religious life of what was then called the American colony. And it was integral to everyday life at Port-Rue de Chevreuse until 1934, when it was completely dismantled. Ernest Hemingway was among the many regulars at St. Luke's. In 1924, he and his wife had their son christened at the chapel in the company of Gertrude Stein, who was also a regular, and other notable figures of the Montparnasse community. Another devout member of the Church of the Holy Trinity was Elizabeth Mills Reid. She had lived in Paris during her childhood and received her confirmation at Holy Trinity in 1874, in the same class as John Singer Sargent, who later drew her charcoal portrait. She returned to Paris with her husband, who had been named by President Benjamin Harrison as American ambassador to France from 1889 to 1892. Elizabeth was a significant philanthropist and extremely wealthy. As a news article aptly expressed it, her husband's thousands were complemented by her millions. She mainly subsidized charitable causes, including hospitals and nursing schools. At Holy Trinity, she came into contact with a group of women who sought to support the thousands of American women artists who had come to Paris to practice their art. Many of these women were living rather lonely existences in small attic rooms around Montparnasse. When she learned this, Reid decided to establish a residential girls' art club so these artists would have a home away from home. To do so, she rented and later bought the entire property that had once been the Keller Institute. At her own expense, Reid renovated the site, furnished the salons, meeting rooms, bedrooms, and embellished the gardens. Her idea was to provide a beautiful space so women artists could thrive in a setting that fostered a sense of community and individual well-being, protected from the brouhaha of Montparnasse, yet near the epicenter of the Belle Époque. Regular social activities were organized specifically for the residents' pleasure or education. To attract people from the neighborhood, Reid subsidized a weekly 5 p.m. tea with guest speakers, and she integrated an art association that staged yearly exhibits where residents could feature their work. More than 1,000 women resided at the club over its 21 years of existence. With Meredith, we created an index of 500 of these artists. Finding their names required quite a bit of sleuthing, since there are no records of club residents or exhibitors. To complicate matters, several exhibited under a pseudonym, often that of a man. While many were quite successful in their day, most have been forgotten in art historical circles. So there's a thesis here, folks. Okay? Given the club's success and increasing demands to become a member of the club, Reid decided to expand the property and add a new building on site. She hired the French-American architect Charlie Knight, who later built the American Hospital and the Foyer International des Étudiantes on Boulevard Saint-Michel. And if you go to the Boulevard Saint-Michel, you'll see there's a very uncanny kind of resemblance in many respects to Reid Hall. In its finished state, the annex included 20 bedrooms, 7 private studios, and a rooftop terrace. Reid also asked Knight to design an exhibition room and to transform the former exhibition space into a library. So that's the library up here. Before that, it was the exhibition space. The room that Knight designed is the very place where you are now seated, newly restored and modernized. Residents only benefited from the upgrades for 2 years, since World War I broke out in 1914 and most of the women returned to the United States. Faced with an empty building, Reid transformed the entire place into a hospital that first housed the French Red Cross and French wounded soldiers. When the US joined the war effort, General Pershing, who was a very good friend of Reid's, asked her to transfer the hospital to the American Expeditionary Forces, which she did in 1917. So from November 1917 to April 1919, 4 Rue de Chevreuse became a haven of rest and support for wounded American officers. In the last 6 months of 1918 alone, 1,524 patients were admitted to Reid's hospital. In 1919, the American Red Cross moved its administrative headquarters to 4 Rue de Chevreuse, remaining until 1922. As the war drew to a close, a group of alumni and heads of women's colleges in the United States banded together to propose the creation of an international club for university women in Paris. Reid agreed to subsidize their efforts and turned the property over to them in 1922, when the Red Cross finally vacated the premises. Together, they created the American University Women's Club. The club president was Virginia Gildersleeve, Dean of Barnard College. Members of the board included women from Bryn Mawr, Vassar, Wellesley, and Smith colleges, and Helen Rogers Reid, Barnard alumni, and Elizabeth's daughter-in-law. Dorothy Flagleet, also a Barnard alum, was elected as resident director in 1926. These 3 women oversaw 4 Rue de Chevreuse through every one of its incarnations from 1922 through 1963. At the club, and here you have an image of the Grande Salle that you're sitting in right now. At the club, women residents profited from all the comforts that Reid had restored to the property and took full advantage of holiday gatherings and the numerous talks given by notable local and international scholars and artists. Marie Curie, for example, came regularly to speak, or lunch in the gardens, and Nadia Boulanger held musical workshops. Between 1928 and 1929, Reid funded a major overhaul of the property, including restoring the roof over the U-shaped building, transforming the studios on the ground floor of the annex into a large dining room, and adding a new story to house artist studios on top of what used to be the terrace, which we all regret, right? Wouldn't it be great to have a terrace nowadays? Okay. In recognition of Reid's unfailing support and benefactions, the board of directors decided to name the property Reid Hall in 1928. Reid died unexpectedly in 1931, but her daughter-in-law, Helen Rogers Reid, continued to subsidize the on-site activities until the onset of World War II. Can you imagine what this family has done for this place? I mean, it's absolutely amazing, right? In 1939, the university women returned to the US, and Reid Hall was left in the hands of a caretaker, alone again. It remained empty until 1941, when Helen Rogers Reid agreed to rent it to the French Ministry of Higher Education until the end of the war. The ministry decided to use Reid Hall as a residence for the women studying at the École Normale Supérieure des Jeunes Filles de Sèvres, since their school had been expropriated by German troops who had ransacked the rooms, stolen the furniture, and looted the supplies. The Sévriennes, for whom Reid Hall served as a welcome refuge, overstayed their welcome. remaining on site through June 1947, when Gildersleeve and Leet had to use every one of their political network powers to be able to regain control over the property. With the rise of internationalization on numerous American campuses, France became the primary destination for study and research. The board of directors reopened Reid Hall to resident research fellows and independent students enrolled at the Sorbonne or at other centers of higher education in Paris. With the emergence of study abroad as an important facet of American university education, Reid Hall became the natural hub for French language immersion programs specifically designed for junior year students. In the 50s, an increasing number of undergraduate and graduate study programs sent cohorts of students to Paris and Reid Hall for year-long or short-term summer opportunities. Students and faculty traveled on ocean liners, using the long crossing as a favorable occasion for orientation sessions and social functions. And this is why you see Jacqueline on the boat. Upon arrival, these students resided either at Reid Hall or with French families and attended French language classes at Reid Hall and the Sorbonne. Gradually, male students were admitted to these programs. Mind you, in the past, it was impossible for men to really come here without a special invitation. Okay. Male students were admitted to these programs, and an increasing number of universities made Reid Hall their administrative headquarters. This is from the Smith Archives, everybody. Beautiful photos that were taken and that we snuck away with. In 1964, Helen Rogers Reid gifted the entire place to Columbia University. At that time, Smith, Hamilton, Sarah Lawrence, and Wesleyan, all of whom are still at Reid Hall today, and other universities, accelerated their own study abroad programs. Columbia University has only established its own program in 1972. By then, students no longer lived on site, and the dining room was shut in 1977. Today, Reid Hall continues as a vibrant study abroad center for Columbia and a variety of American universities and colleges. And although bedrooms have been gradually converted into office spaces, and what was once a dining room has now become a conference room, the French adage, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, holds even true today. Voilà, in a nutshell. Thank you, everyone. And if ever you're interested in looking at the details of the history, we created a website that has all the details that we managed to gather together. And it's still a work in progress in the sense that we wanted to do a website because we wanted to be able to update it as we receive new information, right? But by the same token, we've also decided to ask Columbia University Press to let us do a book. And we're still waiting to hear the news as to whether or not it's going to be accepted as a book. So at any rate, if you have the little cards from Reid Hall, on the back of those cards, the ones that you find at reception, you'll see a QR code that leads you to the Reid Hall website. So, history website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brun, for such a passionate narrative of the history of Reid Hall. Brun has worked at Reid Hall in Paris since 1984. What is remarkable is somehow in her busy, busy job as director of Reid Hall and Columbia Global Centers Paris, she's able to deep dive into the history and archives, create a website, a QR code. I mean, that is amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. Yes, we can thank the pandemic for just a few things, and this is one of them. It is my privilege to introduce the next guest speaker who will speak about Jacqueline in Paris by Ann Mah. Before we do that, can I just see a show of hands of everyone who's ever done a junior year abroad at JYA? Okay. Thank you very much. And for those who spent it here at Reid Hall? There you go. Okay, great. Wonderful. So this is very much home away from home for many of you. Our next speaker, we share something in common with Ann Mah, Janet Skeslien Charles, myself and Ann Mah. We are all colleagues at the American Library in Paris, except never at the same time. So Janet Skeslien Charles is the award-winning author of Moonlight in Odessa and the Paris Library, and her work has been translated into 37 languages. Her shorter work has appeared in reviews such as Slice and Montana Noir. She learned about the history of the American Library in Paris while working there as the program's manager. Today, she divides her time between Montana and Paris, and she's working on her third novel about a librarian in France during World War I. Please help me welcome Janet Skeslien Charles.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Yes? All right. Well, bring it up. Oh my goodness, I am tall. I am tall. And not very strong. How does it? There we go. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. Is that better? There we go. All right. Well, good evening. Ann Mah changed my life. She and I met in 2010 when we were panelists at Weiss's writing conference here in Paris. At that time, she was the programs manager for the American Library in Paris. When the two of us met a few weeks later, she confided that she was moving on from the position to write full-time, and she not only encouraged me to apply, she recommended me. While working there, I learned about the incredible librarians who defied the Nazis in order to deliver books to patrons during World War II. My novel, The Paris Library, is a New York Times and international bestseller sold in 37 languages. And it all started thanks to lunch with Ann Mah. Over the years, we've commiserated over everything from the quirky situations we encountered as the programs manager to the difficult wait as our agent submitted our work to editors, to the tricky politics of literary awards. I've heard from other authors who, like me, have appreciated Ann's support. Most recently, author Carolyn Prusa, who wrote, "Ann was an editor at Viking when I was a publicity assistant. I was super intimidated by her, and yet she was incredibly supportive when my book came out." I can see why Ann was drawn to Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. They share the same elegance, intelligence, work as editors in New York, and a love of the written word. A forerunner in blogging, Ann shared her experiences of Paris with readers from all over the world. The post I remember most is where Ann went to a restaurant and she and her dining companions were refused tap water when they requested a carafe d'eau. The waiter told her it was bottled water or no water at all. Ann wrote a frank review of that dining experience, and as you might expect, the restaurant owner got a lot of attention for his unscrupulous and illegal action. He reached out to Ann, and he promised to serve tap water from then on. She kept the blog post up, but she removed the name of the restaurant. Having made her point and ensured a wrong was righted, she moved on. This situation describes Ann, eloquent and not afraid to stand up for what is right. I'm in awe of Ann. It is daunting to write about an icon, and those of us who have read her novel can see the research and love that she poured into the book, Jacqueline in Paris. It takes place during Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis's junior year abroad, a time that she later described as the high point of my life, my happiest and most carefree year. Anne writes in the first person, so we share Jacqueline's thoughts and feelings throughout. The portrait is full of empathy for a young student torn between duty to her parents and her artistic instincts. Jacqueline learns about Europe through her experiences instead of from the things that she reads in newspapers back home. Ann Mah's novel underlines the theme of tonight's event, the transformation of our lives when we see and understand places for ourselves. The novel is a love letter to Paris. At that time, Paris was a battlefield of ideologies after this long road of recovery from the war. Spies back then abounded. In Jacqueline in Paris, readers are reminded that the esteemed literary journal, the Paris Review, was funded by the CIA in order to keep an eye on leftist writers. No one was who they seemed. There are many gorgeous lines in the book. I'll share a few passages now. For context, while Jacqueline was in Paris, she lived with the Countess de Renty and her daughter, Ghislaine. Jacqueline was seeing a young man named Jack. And on to the text. From page 158, there was an idea that wouldn't let go, a word Ghislaine had used during our conversation, s'engager. In my mind, I had translated it to engage, but now I remembered it meant something else, to commit. On veut s'engager, Ghislaine had said about French women. We want to commit. She meant women like her own mother, who hadn't been able to join the army or to vote, but who had seen their country so damaged they found their own way to resist. The war had altered Madame's life in terrible ways, but it had left her with a commitment to her fellow female resistance that I deeply admired. I couldn't think of a weekday that Madame hadn't volunteered at the ADIR, an advocacy group for women who had been deported or imprisoned during the war. It was the type of devotion not often seen in the drawing rooms of Mummy and her friends. I wasn't certain about the isms I'd seen floating around Paris: communism, socialism, conservatism, feminism, all of them blinking with their own particular signal. I felt something stirring within me, an indefinable hunger to do more. Paris was awakening me, giving me the energy I hadn't felt before, challenging me to commit to something larger than myself. On page 220, Anne highlights a feeling that many of us have had when we are far from home, when we can forget our obligations and begin to dream. I lay in Jack's arms, listening to the snap and crackle of the fire, and thinking about all the things that matter to me so much back home, and how they felt so inconsequential here in Paris. I imagined the life that Jack and I could have, and it sparkled with fun and sophistication and adventure. We would sunbathe on Mediterranean beaches. We would visit ancient Silk Road outposts and invite friends over to eat raclette on cold winter nights. Of course, there are difficult moments too. On page 234, at a gathering of French friends, Jacqueline says, I felt a dart of discomfort. He's telling a joke that I don't quite understand. The others guffaw, their big goofy grins captured forever with the click of a camera. Their laughter is a declaration of their familiarity, their particular humor, their relationship intertwined for generations. It reminds me that I am different, and that I'll never truly be a part of their world, despite my fluency and my francophilia. I am right here with them, but I am not one of them. Anne said that writing this book allowed her to escape to Paris when she physically couldn't come here during the pandemic. It kept her dreaming when the world felt very bleak. I'll end with Anne's words from her author's note. Most books about Jacqueline Kennedy Bouvier Onassis gloss over her time in Paris, dismissing it as a brief, insignificant period in a life filled with great historic moments. But I believe that this year, the academic year of 1949 to 1950, was when she was able to be her most genuine self, far from the security and expectations of her family, before her tumultuous marriage or motherhood, or the relentless glare of international fame. She was able to determine what truly mattered in her life, and she could set out to achieve it. France would forever be her guiding compass. The French language and culture would remain her intellectual refuge. Anne eloquently describes the privilege that so many of us here share tonight. Time abroad to think, to challenge ourselves, to grow, to learn. If you haven't read Jacqueline in Paris, I hope that you'll enjoy it as much as I did. And we look forward to seeing Anne very soon when she returns to Paris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet, for those words about Jacqueline in Paris and Ann Mah. I'm going to now invite on stage our panelists, starting with Janet. If you can please sit right there, that'd be wonderful. Try, in any way that you can. Followed by Marie-Madeleine, please. Cross. Nathaniel Nate Norberg, please, on that chair. And Marie Dozema, right at the corner there. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to switch over to a kind of brief, moderated discussion inspired by Jacqueline in Paris, study abroad, junior year abroad, Reid Hall, and we're going to dip in and out of these questions that I have here for each of our panelists, which I'm going to introduce, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. So please be thinking of things that you would like to ask our esteemed panel. And then absolutely, we will be having champagne thereafter. And book sales, if you have not gotten your copy of Jacqueline in Paris, the Red Wheelbarrow is here with a lot of copies, so please. So Janet is here. Next to Janet is Marie-Madeleine Charles, who was Administrative Director of Smith College Paris since 2007. She was born and raised in Montreal, got an MA in McGill University, and a DEA at the Sorbonne. She has worked in the study abroad field for many years, here in Paris and in the United States. Please welcome Marie-Madeleine Charles. Next to Marie-Madeleine is Nathaniel Nate Norberg, graduated from Smith in 2019, where he majored in French and minored in chemistry. He spent his JYA here in Reid Hall in 2017-2018, where he started as an intern at Paris Eye Imaging. Now he is in the process of completing a master's, in neuroscience at Sorbonne University, and then will be continuing onto a PhD in biomedical engineering in the fall at the Institute of Vision. Please welcome Nate. Marie Dozema joined Columbia Global Centers Paris in the fall of 2022 to support and develop special projects. She is developing a forthcoming podcast series which shares the cultural, intellectual, and artistic community of the Paris Center. Previously, Marie worked as a journalist and editor in Japan, Qatar, and across the US and Europe. She has taught journalism at Sciences Po, the Sorbonne, and has led journalism workshops across sub-Saharan Africa. She also did her junior year abroad here at Reid Hall. So please welcome Marie Dozema. Wonderful. So my first question is actually for Janet. So Ann Mah, who clearly loves Paris, writes affectionately about Paris with so much detail that the city really comes alive. Janet, I wanted to just know what favorite part of Paris came out for you in the book?
Let me see. Is it on? Yes, all right, okay. I think what fascinated me most was the portrait of life après-guerre. I thought that was just so beautiful, and it's a period of France, or a period in France in Paris that I really didn't know that much about, and so I thought she brought that period to life so well, and I just thought it was absolutely, absolutely incredible what she did.
Right. As an author of historic fiction yourself, Janet, you probably know there's a fine balance between fiction and creativity when you write historical fiction, particularly when it's someone as iconic as Jacqueline Bouvier. How do you think Anne navigated that line?
Well, that's why I said I'm just daunted and so impressed by Anne, because I know from my own book I had a librarian named Dorothy Reeder, and I was so afraid to put words in her mouth or get it wrong that my character was really wooden. And so I admire how Anne was able to just dive in with a character that we all know or think we know. So I think what she did is just absolute genius. She did a brilliant job.
Wonderful. Marie-Madeleine, yes, you have the unique experience and perspective of someone who has been in study abroad for almost 20 years.
Or more than that.
More than 20
Yes.
plus years. So my
Forever.
question is, in your vantage point, how have things changed over these past 20 years? Student motivations and expectations?
Well, what changed, the first thing is internet. Before? Okay. The first thing is internet. I mean, it changed everything because this distance is not the same. Students are close to their family all the time. I had a student who had been pickpocketed in September, and within 15 minutes, she was in FaceTime with her father and resolving the problem. I suppose that in the 50s, distance was bigger, and the uniqueness of the experience was another thing. I mean, it's not the same than 50 years ago.
Right. This idea about being able to communicate
Yes.
with family and friends back at stateside when you're doing a junior year abroad. I remember having a conversation with Janet. She actually came over as a senior in high school to Paris, and she remembers only being able to communicate with her family with these little airmail things where you have to fold in a special way, and the envelope is your letter, and you send it off, and you had to wait for a response. And so that communication, I think, definitely has changed.
And it's something I try to fight against. When I see the students, I said, stop doing Facebook. Well, it's not Facebook anymore, it's Twitter, or I don't know what. It's just, don't talk about your experience to your friend. Just do it. I mean, and don't live a meta-vie. Comme je dis, it's not a life. It's not a meta-life where you explain what you did. Do.
Yes. I wanted to just touch upon language, particularly immersion in a foreign culture. Language is probably one of the key things that marks your time in Paris and in France. Marie-Madeleine, do you think speaking French changes the way these students present themselves and in the way that they express themselves in this foreign language?
Well, it's a good question for Nate, though.
Yes, we'll get to Nate. Definitely get to Nate.
Because I had a problem with Nate. That was in 2017.
Yeah.
He got a B1 at his first test of language, which is low intermediate. And after a year in Paris, he had a B1, which is a low intermediate. But he spoke very good French. So I said, what happened? He said, I didn't want to take the test. But
in a very beautiful room, in my defense. It was the first sunny day in about 4 months. I had finally see the sunshine from the top of this gorgeous room, and we sit on the, thank you. Then we're on the computer for 4 hours, and it was difficult. It was the last few days of the program. I did not want to be taking an exam.
Okay.
But for students, I mean, because we are the only year-long program, junior year-long program, it's true that they started in September, living in a host family, living at the end of May. I mean, they made a lot of progress. It's inevitable that they will progress in French.
Mm-hmm.
And French will be their secret language when they go back to Paris. They keep it after that, yes.
Right.
And the pledge,
code
yes,
d'honneur.
yeah, we have, as some other programs, students have to sign a pledge that they will speak French only. I mean, we know that it's not possible all the time, but they play the game in our office, in our field trip, in our excursions, and in everywhere. But if there's a crisis, of course, they will speak in English with me.
Great. So, Nate, when you came for your junior year abroad here, it was the first time outside coming from Minnesota, correct?
Indeed.
First time out of the United States, coming into Paris. What were your expectations in your fantasy eye about Paris, and how did that confrontation with the real thing affect you?
Well, first off, like Marie-Madeleine said, my French at first wasn't the strongest. So I thought that studying for 10 years would set me up fairly well. I had read so many books, I'd really thought about Paris, my parents had talked to me about their experiences here. I could say approximately 2 words. My expectations were much higher than that for myself. But at the end of the year, we were able to figure it out. Otherwise, something that really surprised me was in the US, you can kind of go to the store anytime you want to, especially on a Sunday evening. You can find an open restaurant. With the deal with the host families, we eat 2 dinners out per week. So every Sunday night, it was kind of a game of which neighborhood had a restaurant that was open and new and exciting. So it was fun, and yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. What motivated you to go on your junior year abroad? What?
Before coming to Smith, I had heard about the JOA program and was really intrigued that it was a year-long program. I did not want to leave the U.S. for the first time to get used to something for 4 months and go back. I really wanted to try a new place out and see what would happen to me and what would happen if I tried something new for so long. Mm-hmm. And I was really happy to have that opportunity from Smith, and also the JOA program here helped as a hybrid almost from like the hand-holding that Smith provides in the American education system, where you're like Robin said earlier, kind of introduced to this new world of coming out of adolescence. But then in French schooling, especially in a master's level, you're very much left on your own. So the JOA program is a great hybrid option to get me kind of in the zone, and more so into adulthood and also into France, and really adjust better.
Right. Wonderful. And look, you're back for your master's and afterwards a doctorate. So yeah, this was definitely the junior year abroad just kind of sparked that, and you've come back. So wonderful. Marie, you have an interesting experience not only living abroad in France, but also Japan. But first, can you tell us what was the most striking memory that you have from your junior year abroad here in Paris?
Definitely. I did the Vassar Wesleyan program with Lisa Fleury when she was still here in 1998, and I think I don't think I necessarily had specific expectations in coming here. To me, I had been studying French. I had minored in French. I was an international studies major, so it was a very obvious thing for me to do. I think I was surprised by the impact that it had on me quite immediately. Yeah. Without sounding overly dramatic, it really felt like I was awake for the first time, coming abroad and living abroad, where everything was new, everything was different, everything was hard in a new way, and I loved it. I mean, it really did wake me up. It wasn't my first time leaving the U.S., but it was my first time living as an adult, as a young adult outside of the U.S. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I left Oklahoma to go to Vassar because I felt like I was in a bubble that I wanted to leave. But in another way, going to Vassar made me feel like I was just in a different sort of bubble. Mm-hmm. And I was so happy to get to Paris, where I felt like at last I was out of a bubble. Paris is probably its own bubble. So I think then it made me want to spend my life trying to get outside of bubbles.
So after getting out of the Oklahoma bubble and you came to Paris, how did that experience in France doing your study abroad inform or help, or just basically when you went and worked in Japan? And you speak Japanese as well too, correct? How was that experience helped in any way?
I mean, it was that experience of living in France that made me want to keep doing that. And I did go back to Vassar for my final year, though I was completely tempted, as Jacqueline was. I was like, I did not want to go back, but for very practical reasons, of course, I went back and finished my degree. But then I moved back to France immediately after and stayed here for a couple of years.
studying Arabic, and that's when I started working in journalism for the first time. And it was that experience, though, that first experience of living abroad that made me want to keep experiencing that. And I had, some years later, the opportunity to go to Japan. It was on a Henry Luce Fellowship, which was the most extraordinary experience, because the idea back then was they would send 15 Americans in different professions who had no experience in Asia to anywhere in Asia. And so I had never studied Japanese, I had never thought of going to Japan, and I had the opportunity to do that. And I did a crash course at Middlebury College in Japanese for 2 months before moving to Japan. And that was such an extraordinary experience. In some ways it made living abroad look easy, because it really was a boot camp, and you would get kicked out if you were caught speaking English or reading English or doing anything and that was not in Japanese. And of course I went there with no Japanese. And so I spent the first few weeks completely silent. I mean, I could not, I was living in a dorm with students who were much better at Japanese than I was, who had studied it for several years. And all of the first year students, we were just quiet. We didn't have the right to speak. And I remember, learning how to say excuse me in Japanese, and then going to the dinner table and on purpose knocking things over just so I could use my word that I had learned. But in that sense, when I finally moved to Japan, I was very well equipped after 2 months, at least at a beginner level, but it made it seem easy because I wouldn't get kicked out just for talking to somebody in English or reading an English newspaper. But it was definitely that experience in France that made me want more.
To continue basically living abroad. Nate, I'm thinking about you starting your junior year abroad as a B1, ending it as a B1. How are you feeling with French today? How are you navigating language? You must be at least a B2 now.
Sorry about that.
I am.
You have to at least be a B2. And how does that change when your language improves? Does that make Paris open up to you?
Indeed. So I've never taken the test again. I absolutely refuse. But I did my master's in French, so I'm feeling higher than a B2.
Definitely a B2, for sure.
I would aim for C1. I forgot the other part of your question. Excuse me.
Yeah, so how is just being more proficient in French kind of change your experience of Paris and France and living here?
Well, at first it was impossible to talk to people. It was a lot of me being silent at the bar, drinking my wine quietly. And then once I started to understand better, it was like, okay, I can't be funny yet, but maybe I can make some odd comment here or there. And then when the master's started, then it was also 2020, so the ripe COVID era. So only French students. Some of the classes were anticipated to be in English, but they said, oh, there's no international students, we'll do it all in French. So very quickly, I learned French on the coffee breaks, hearing everything. I was like, okay, I can do this. J-Way was the practice, this is the real deal, let's go. And now I feel much more comfortable, things go much more smoothly. I'm not 100%, but at the bank, for example, I know what's up. I'm able to get my hair cut, do all the normal things you have to do. I'm feeling okay about it.
You're feeling pretty good. Definitely, I feel like you are definitely a B2. Plus, also, you have what Americans strive for here, our French friends, correct?
Indeed. Took a while, and something that surprised me was Americans can be so warm at first and maybe harder to get close to. Frenchies, so cold at first, not like Minnesota at all. But then a year later, I was like, oh, now I have genuine close connections with people, and I actually have people that I trust and care about. And I was like, it was worth the wait. That's awesome.
Janet, I'm going to come back to you, Janet. So you came to France, not for the first time, but you were a senior in high school. What were some of your expectations coming in, was it 1989? Yes, wow. Okay. Tell us a little bit about 1989 and your senior year abroad in high school.
I stayed with the family. What I remember doing at school was right away when the proviseur said hello to me, I said, salut, which made the whole school erupt in laughter. So I think a lot of times when you make mistakes when you're studying abroad, there are mistakes that you remember for life because they really mark you. So yes, that's one of the first things I remember about that time. But I also remember just the warmness and the kindness of that host family, and they came to my wedding in 2000. So what Nate is saying about lifelong friends, it's really true.
I might, at this point, maybe ask if there are questions in the audience, and I believe Robin is going to pass the microphone around.
Hi. Janet, I'd like to ask you, because we haven't spoken very much about the book, in which ways is it history, in which ways is it fiction? What does Ann Mah do to make it fiction?
Well, I think this is a question that only Ann Mah can answer, but I'll give it a shot. I think it was deeply researched. So I think everything that is in the book about living with the host family, about going to Sciences Po, the friends that she made or didn't make, I think that's all true. One thing that she does that's interesting in the book is once or twice she'll have Jacqueline look back on her life and say, people wrote this about me, but they didn't understand. And so I appreciated those moments, those retrospective moments. But I think you can read, there are very few things that she changed. You can read her author's note, and she describes the one or two things that she changed, and she gives a wonderful context. And I always read author's notes first, so I can only recommend that note in the book.
We have two people here, one of whom was on the JYA program with Jacqueline, and the other who was here just afterwards. I wonder if individually you'd like to share something with us about those years. The Jackie year is Ann Athling.
I was in the class with Jackie, and all I can say is I agree with her. It changed my life. And as soon as I got my kids out the door, I began coming back. And every year I've come back, and it's been a sheer joy. I'm here for 3 months right now, but I'm coming back in the fall.
Nice to know. Lois Brunhilde, who is our President Emerita, and who was here 1 year after Jackie.
Right. And it was actually because Boone sent her, the author, I will spit into the microphone, okay? Now, Reid Hall played a very important part in my life because it was in Montparnasse, and it was a center for artists, intellectuals, and I have special thanks to the person who opened the door, because I lived upstairs, and I'll stop there. But I had met 2 young men at a New Year's Eve evening get-together. There were 5 of us, and one of them was a physicist, and he called, and we had a date, and she called upstairs. There was one telephone up there where the artist studios are, so you had to run down the hall. She would buzz you in the room, run down the hall, pick up the phone. There's a gentleman waiting in the salon. Thank you very much. I'll be right down. This is short. Yeah, it turned later. And she rang again. I was finishing brushing my hair, and she said, "There's someone waiting for you." I said, "Thank you very much. You just call me, and I'll be right down." "No, it's not the same one. He's in the other room." So discretion was the order of the day.
One of the 2 of them became Lois's husband. One of the 2 of these men became your husband, yes?
I thank Smith because I came speaking French at the time. When I was a student, Smith was known as the best university for French. French was the international language. You have to remember this. It was not English, it was French. And French culture was the thing to have. And this was post-war France. People were poor. They had something made by the couturier around the corner. I mean, the couturier, the seamstress. And those who had money, like the Bouviers, could live the good life. I met these people later.
Who else has questions?
What did Jackie wear as a student here?
What did Jackie wear during her?
How were you all dressed? And Jackie in particular?
Jackie was an exceptionally wealthy woman, so whatever she wore was high couture.
Hi, I had a question for Janet, just on the process of writing historical fiction. Like, how do you know when to stop researching? How do you balance creating a story with doing research? I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about balancing those.
I never stop researching, which is why it takes me so long. So I don't recommend that. But on a personal note, it's so interesting that I think it's worth it. I think it's absolutely worth it. My book was published. I think it was finished in 2019, published in 2021. But I kept researching and kept finding out information about the librarians at the American Library in Paris. Even though the book was done, I kept going. It's absolutely fascinating. I would say I have to write in the morning, and then because if you don't write, you never write. So you have to kind of force yourself to eventually get to the page and maybe research in the afternoon or in the evening, depending on what your job is, or whatever time, but that morning time or the evening time, whatever your time is to write, you have to make that a priority. You have to make that a priority.
Why do you feel you have to have recourse to fiction at the same time? Why couldn't it become a biography rather than a fictionalized account?
Well, in my book, there were certain themes that I wanted to talk about, such as forgiveness, such as shame, and so those themes that I wanted to talk about worked better for me in fiction than they would have in nonfiction. The book would have been a great nonfiction book about the group of librarians who defied the Nazis. It would have been, I think, a very interesting nonfiction book, and someone is writing a nonfiction book about the American Library in Paris, as I understand it. But for me, the themes were just as important as the historical facts, and so I wanted my fictional characters to explore those feelings and those themes.
And for those who know Ann Mah, she is probably one of the most avid researchers. She will not only research archives and interview people, but she will also deep dive into actually doing the things. So for her book, The Lost Vintage, she actually spent, I believe, several weeks picking grapes and making it into wine. And for this book, Jacqueline in Paris, she spent a good time walking in the footsteps of Jacqueline Bouvier, visiting all the places that she did. She did horseback riding. She went to many of the places that are indicated in the book. And so for her, it's very, very immersive. And the book really shines through with some of those details. You can see what kind of researcher she is.
Yeah, so for Marie-Madeleine, I have a question. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. So how have you seen the student body changing over the years? Like, I know that one year there were a number of students from China. You now have fewer students, I believe, than before COVID. Like, why do they come? Who comes? And how is that different from when you started?
It is true that it was before a more homogeneous group of students, and now it's more diverse, not only in terms of citizenship, but also in terms of sexual orientation and all that. We have fewer students than before COVID, but next year it will be close to the figures we were used to. So we're very happy about that. Otherwise, what was your other question? I mean, the size of the group, diversity. Why do they come?
Motivation.
The first one is because they want to learn a new culture. They want to learn the French culture and they want to improve their language. This is why their motivation. And we have a Sciences à Paris program. So we have next year about half of the group are STEM students. So they want to experiment what is science in France and in the French universities. But that's a brand new thread. I mean, like going from doing science in United States and trying some science here in France with internship, with laboratoire and all that. So it's a new generation of students.
Can I rebound on that and ask you a question? How do the students react to the difference in academic assessment, the absence, for instance, of, in the States we have a Socratic method, and it's also very encouraging. Here it's more rote knowledge, especially at their stage, and one can't say that the grading system is particularly encouraging. How do they react to that?
They are very surprised. Because, I mean, they are faced to another reality. As Marie-Do said tout à l'heure, I mean, they were in a bubble and then they are confronted to a new reality that can be hurt for their, that can hurt their humbleness, I would say. And so, but I mean, they have a lot of help also. They have help for tutor, they help them for classes. So they managed to do it. I think that a year-long program is a very good thing because it happened that after the one semester, they get it. And the second semester, they can really improve and they know what they're doing and they know how to write a paper and they know how to do the research. And when they come back on campus, they are more independent. I have a colleague in the French department who said they have the elegance of knowledge. That means that we don't have to tell them they have to read from page 1 to page 20. They know they can work alone independently after 1 year here in Paris.
Hi, I just have an observation. I too spent my junior year abroad in 1972, and it was a very powerful experience, all of what you were saying. I found my life's work, and then later in life, as I pivoted and developed into some other areas, I was accepted into a program in my later life in Rome. So I just want to mention that the power of this experience should also be thought of and expanded, I think, to other age groups. It was very important to me and very powerful for my work now.
Thank you. I think someone up here wanted to ask a question. We have time for a few more questions and then we offer you things to drink and eat.
This is just a general question, but one thing I really appreciated in the Ann Mah's book was the aspect of Jacqueline Kennedy being taken seriously as a woman who was studying abroad in the late 40s, early 50s, the strong women that are shown in the book, and her grasp of what was going on at the time, post-war France and beginning of the Cold War. How other people have read it too. Obviously, we now know that she became the first lady and was very appreciated in France and was a great diplomat for our country. Do you think that was exaggerated, or is the part about her grasping current events at the time that she was here? But I also want to thank Ann Mah for showing that side of it, because I think study abroad, having worked in study abroad for many years, can be considered a nice tourist year or a year we all know that most are women who study abroad, so just a nice year to spend a year in Paris. How many people have said that to you? Whereas we know that it can be absolutely formative for our careers and our families and people that we talk to. So how real was that?
If we understand, you want to know how true to reality was the book?
One thing that Ann Mah points out in the book is that there was a certain level of classes that the women in her group were studying, but she asked to take the next level up at Sciences Po, and she was accepted in those classes. So I think she really was very academically minded and very curious, and she did ask to go to take that higher level, and so yes, I think she was academic minded then.
Any more questions?
Maybe one last question, and we must absolutely have champagne.
It's kind of developing on her. Jackie was here while France was having war with Indochina. And then she goes and marries Kennedy, who starts the Vietnam War. And I wonder, did she learn anything from her French experience with Indochina, being at Sciences Po?
He didn't start it. He took it over from the French after Dien Bien Phu.
I don't think that subject is really brought up in the book. That's a good question, but I don't think that it's brought up. Her specific classes aren't really brought up in the book.
No, it's not in the book itself. But 10 years after her junior year abroad here in Paris, she comes back as the First Lady with John F. Kennedy. And because she was Francophone, she charmed the pants off of General de Gaulle and André Malraux, two of probably the hardest to please Frenchmen in history. And she somehow charmed them because of her love of France and French history, and that she spoke so well. So yeah, and that was only just 10 short years after her study abroad experience. She got the Mona Lisa too, yeah.
So should we
Thank you.
hand this over to you to end
Thank you
it?
so much. Thank you so much for coming.